Today's daf is daf Nun Ches. And on the top of the Omud, we're discussing a hen that the eggs were hatched. And the question is, if the hen is treifa, what's the status of the eggs? Shichla. Now, it seems that when the Gemara wants to describe the eggs that were hatched, the Gemara describes two groups of eggs. Shichla is the first group of eggs, and Asira, those are treif. Now, the reason for that is because the eggs were formed in the body of the mother hen before it became a treifa. And if that be the case, we apply a halachic principle, which is called ubar yerech imo, that the fetus, in this case the egg of the hen, is considered part of the mother hen. So when the mother gets into an accident, she falls from a roof or she falls into a fire, etc., and one of the internal organs were punctured and the animal became a treifa, then that halachic status, which is called the chalos of treifa, is chal on everything in the body of the hen, because the eggs in the body of the hen are part of the body of the hen. Mikan v'elech, however, if there's a second batch of eggs that are hatched subsequent to the mother hen becoming a treifa, meaning after its accident, then we believe that these eggs were formed after the mother hen became a treifa. And paradoxically, in that case, the eggs are mutter. They're not treifa. And the Gemara is going to try to explain why. Because havile zeveze gorem umutter, which means that these are fertilized eggs, and the mother was fertilized by virtue of a male rooster. So you have a combination of two parents that are equally partners in the creation of these eggs. And as far as the male is concerned, he's not a treifa. Only the female in this case is a treifa. And that's called zeveze gorim, when you have two factors that cause a result. A plus B have an impact generating C. A is aser, B is mutter, and that's going to be a major controversy, but we're now reflecting that opinion that says zev is a gore mutter, and therefore the eggs that were hatched after the animal and developed in the mother's body after the animal became a treifa, they are mutter based on or by virtue of the principle of zev is a gore mutter. Now, the big question here, which require more of an Ian shear, but I'll just briefly touch on it, is what about the principle that we mentioned earlier about Uber Yerech Imo? I mean, after all, when the animal became a treifa, the animal is still alive. The eggs are being developed in the hen that's a treifa's body, and they are part of the body of the animal. The status of treifa should now incorporate and include also the eggs. So apparently what happens is that when the animal becomes a treifa, and then the eggs are developed in its body, those eggs are already seen from the perspective of Hilchos Treifa as a separate entity. They're not part of the mother hen. Eisvei Rav Ashi Neimar Vishavin Bebeitzas Treifa Shasura. We have a brisa that says that Vishavin, okay, so this refers to a machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, which the Gemara cites later on. They argue about the Vlad of a treifa, the offspring of a treifa, but everybody agrees, according to the Brisa of Rav Ashi, that Beitzas treifa asura mipnei shegodla be'isur. Now, Meimar had just finished telling us that the eggs of the treifa bird, meaning on the second round, are mutter. And here we see in this brisa that everybody agrees, there was never a debate about it, that the baits of the treifa is asura. Now, the Gemara could have given a very easy answer here. Tosfos is bothered. Maybe the brisa is addressing not the second clutch, the second group of eggs, but maybe the first group of eggs. But Tosfos tries to explain why the Gemara didn't want to use that answer, but rather offered a different answer. Hasam b'desafna me'ara. We're not talking over there in that brisa about fertilized eggs. Like, for example, our eggs today that we buy and eat are not fertilized, but rather the hen sits on the ground and the process of heating the earth gives them these eggs. And there's no element of a male over here. So the Zev Zegorim principle cannot operate. The Lishnei Le B'Shichla Kama. I said it was Tosfos. The Gemara itself asked this question. My mistake. Why didn't Maimer, to defend himself, just interpret that this brisa is referring to the first clutch of eggs, which we said comes under the principle of Uber Yerech Imo and is Asur. In Cain, there's a diuk in the words of the brisa. It says Gadla. The brisa says that it grew, and it should have said Gamra Mibaile. Right? The key word here is Gamra, meaning it was completed. It was finished. So when the brisa used the word Gadla, which means it was developed, it indicates that we're talking about the subsequent eggs that were developed after the fowl became treifa. Now the Gemara asks the following question. Now that we have a Meimar and the case where the brisa says Shavin, that both Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua agree that the eggs are treif, the Gemara says, Elahad Desanya, what do we do with the following brisa? Vlad treifa, the status of the Vlad of treifa as far as Mizbeach is concerned, and this is sugya elsewhere in Masechta Menachos about why the Vlad of a treifa, or forget about the Vlad of a treifa, why is a treifa pasul Mizbeach? And again, I'm not familiar right now off the top of my head the sugya in Menachos Daf Hey, but I think it has to do with the principle of what's called mimashke Yisrael meramuta beficha. Anything that you're not allowed to eat, you're not allowed to bring on the mizbeach. And now we have a brisa that records a machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua regarding the kashrus or paslus of a vlad treifel of mizbeach. Rabbi Eliezer Omer lo yikrav gabi mizbeach. It's excluded and disqualified from the mizbeach. Rabbi Yeshua Omer yikrav. You can bring it on the mizbeach. So that we see quite clearly that this issue of a machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua is referring to the kashrus of the vlad of a treifa for the mizbeach. So now let's analyze it. B'mai kabifli, what is the exact mitzius that they're arguing about? I'm going to assume that they're arguing about the principle of zev zegorim, which means benitrifol b'sof ibra, that after the animal had this injury and became a treifa, then it became pregnant. And as a result of becoming pregnant, Rabbi Eliezer Sava zev zegorim also Rabbi Yeshua Sava zev zegorim muta. So as we said before, we could neutralize the issue of uber yerech imo because at the time that it became a treifa, there was no ubar. It had not yet been fertilized. And now the only issue is that the eggs might be born to a treifa. They are, in fact, born to a treifa or hatched to a treifa. And then we have to apply a different halachic principle in kashrus, and that's called Yotze. Yotze means Yotze mina osur osur. The whole question about eating honey, dvash, is based on the issue of Hayotze mina osur osur. You're not allowed to eat a bee, as we'll learn in Mitzvah Shem on Sunday. But how can you eat the honey? which is produced by the bee. So the Gemara says that the honey is not really produced by the bee and so forth and so on. But anything, if X produces Y and X is Asur, then Y is Asur. And if it's Asur, then how could Rabbi Yoshua say that it's mutter? And the answer is because it's Yotze mina Asur umina mutter. In other words, what produced this egg in the second clutch, meaning that which was fertilized after it became a treifa, that's the male and the female. So we have here a machlokes as to whether or not zev zegorem is asur or mutter. So Gemara says, if that's the issue of the machlokes, adam if we go for lift the hedgehog, why are they arguing about whether or not you can take this vlad of a treifa that was conceived after the mother hen became a treifa with an accident and so forth and so on? Why not argue about hedgehog, whether or not I'm allowed to eat eat the hatched egg? And the Gemara answers, Lo dicha kolcha Rabbi Yeshua, that not only does Rabbi Yeshua allow you to eat the vlad treifa that was conceived after the mother animal became a treifa, but you're allowed to even bring it on the mizbeach, because the laws of bringing on the mizbeach are more chamur. So the Gemara asks, wait a minute, why are you interested in telling me about Rabbi Yeshua, that he goes as far as to say that the vlad of the treif in this case is mutal mizbeach? Why not tell me a chiddush in hedjot, meaning in our achila, according to Rabbi Eliezer, and that is that Rabbi Eliezer prohibited you from eating the vlad of a treifa. The Gemara says, we have a principle that in order to come up with a heter, you need a more powerful and profound argument, and therefore, whenever we quote you have a possibility of going with a koch that's the surah, koch hetera, adif, it's preferable to go with the koch of hetera. Okay, fine. So now we have a machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua and the Brisa with regard to the eggs that were conceived after the mother animal became a treifa. Fine. Now, the Gemara says, what about the part of the Brisa where there's a universal acceptance? Umodim, everybody agrees, but beitzas treifa shasura. Well, what's that case? I mean, what happened to Rabbi Yeshua Zevizegori Mutter? And the Gemara answers, B'sofna mi'ara dechad gorim. The chad gorim, who means that we neutralize the male element here because the animal was not fertilized through a male, but rather through the heat of the ground. And in such a case, everybody agrees that there's no zev here, so all you have is zegorim, and we're going to apply the principle of yotzim and asar also. Rav Acha, Savraluk Rav Acha Bar Yaakov, and now we're going back to an issue that we touched on yesterday, and that is, can the fact that an animal gives birth, meaning a female animal bears young, does that ipso facto prove that the animal is not a treifa? And we have a chumrah here of Rav Acha Bar Yaakov that we mentioned yesterday, that according to Rav Acha Bar Yaakov, even a treifa could bear young, and therefore the fact that the animal bears a vlad, that doesn't prove that it's not a treifa. It might be a treifa. Umasni lod liramemar kiramor. And Rav Acha teaches that Rav HaMeimar is exactly the way we said it before. However, Ravina lo savralok Rav Acha Bar Yaakov, and he's makil, and he says the treifa could never bear young, and therefore, if you find an animal that bears young, then ipso facto it's not a treifa. And now let's get back to the hen. We had the case of the hen, and the hen had eggs, and we just finished saying that those eggs were fertilized or conceived subsequent to the mother hen's injury that made it into a treifa. And therefore, what we're saying now is that even though the mother hen is having children, right, is bearing young, these eggs that are fertilized, nevertheless, it's a treifa. So you see that treifa can bear young, and and that would support the opinion. Let me just get the names right here. We said the Rav Acha holds that a treifa can bear young. That would support the opinion of Rav Acha and Rav Acha bar Yaakov. Umasni lei de amemar bahai lishna. Right, Ravina is on the other side of the fence, so he has to reinterpret amemar, and according to his transmission, Omar amemar hani bei de suffik treifa. When do we differentiate between the first group of eggs and the second? That's in the case of a suffix treifa. For example, we don't know whether the hen was clawed and it was, it was clawed by a predator that would inject the venom into it, right? That's called a drusa, so a suffix drusa. Or you could have a suffix nefula. In such a case, shichla kama mashhinanla. Let's see what happens to the hen, the mother chicken, in order to determine whether, in fact, she was clawed or she was not clawed. She's a Drusa or not a Drusa, strafe or not. I hadra vitana. If she can produce eggs. Now, once she produces eggs, according to this shita of Ravina, that proves ipso facto that she's not a treifa. And then we say igloi milsala mafreya, that she never was the victim of the predator, of the drusa. Is memela, I can even allow eating the first batch of eggs. Shayan. Shayan means we could permit even the first batch of eggs. Ve'ilo, but if we're still stuck in the suffix, meaning she hasn't produced eggs, which ipso facto would prove that she's not a treifa, then asirin, because we're left with the suffix as to whether or not the mother hen was a treifa. Because again, we waited a while and we didn't see that she produced eggs. Esvei Rav Ashi la Memar. We have a brisa that says Umodim beitzas treifa shasurim and esha godla be'isur. We see that a treifa bird can produce eggs. So why are you telling me that if it produces young, ipso facto, it means it's not a treifa? Some memar stay some relay. Hasam, but it's shichla kama. We're talking about the eggs of the first clutch, and the eggs of the first clutch were generated and developed in the body of the hen before it became a treifa, before it fell prey to a predator. So Gemara asks him, Cain, Godla, why does it say Godla? The truth is, it should have said Gamra Miboile. In other words, the Brisa has to indicate that the eggs were developed in the mother's body before it became a treifa. And therefore, it becomes Uber Yerech Imo and becomes a treifa. So why do you use the term Godla? You should have used the term Gamra. And the Gemara says we're going to have to amend the Brisa. Tni Gamra. Now, at this point, we're going to swing back to the brisa that recorded the machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua regarding Beitzas Treifa Limizbeach, Hadisanya Vlad. It should say Hadisnan, I think. Oh, you have Hadisanya. Vlad Treifa. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Lo Yikrav Legabi Mizbeach. Rabbi Yeshua Omer Yikrav. V'maiko Mifligi. What's the case that they're arguing back? She'ibra Ulabasof Nitrafa. And if that be the case, then we understand Rabbi Eliezer very well, because since the eggs were developed after conception, before the animal, the hen became a treifa, therefore we apply the principle of uber yerech imo. So what do we do at Rabbi Yeshua? Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Yeshua savar uber lav yerech imo. The uber is considered an independent entity. It's not batul muvutal as part of the body of the mother. Ihachi ad mifli gavol lifli behedja lo dicha koch der b'shua lifli behedja lo dicha koch der b'shua koch der tera adiv. Okay. Now, what is the machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua regarding the status of the Vlad, whether it's Yerech Imo or not? But Umodim, the Brisa says that there's no controversy. Vadai, the Beitzas Treifa Shasura. Now, wait a second. Rabbi Yeshua just finished saying that Uber Lav Yerech Imo. So if Uber Lav Yerech Imo, we see the Uber, the eggs in its mother's body, as a separate entity. If it's a separate entity, so then why is it that the Brisa records Vadai, Modim, everybody agrees with Beitzas Treifa Shasura? Why? So the Gemara answers, "But shichla kama my taima gufa he." All right, Tosfos has a whole discussion. What does this mean, gufa he? And we're holding now, according to Rabbi Yeshua, ubar lav yerech imo. So Tosfos, again, this is a little bit beyond our purview, but just to give it on a superficial level, Tosfos is going to distinguish between animals and fowl. That you can have uber lav yerech imo in the case of an animal, but not necessarily in the case of a fowl, of a bird, because even though mammals also do mammals give birth to eggs? I don't remember. Anyway, he says in the case of birds, the eggs are considered part of the hen's actual body. But in mammals, the fetus lives independent of the mother, just that its food is supplied to it by the umbilical cord. And therefore, it's a separate entity. B'hilchasa, b'zachar, if there was a fertilized egg, and therefore the male is b'zakol shnei masar chodesh. No. In general, safek treifa in the case of a zachar. Let's see if it could live and survive for 12 months. Right? This is like Rav Huna that we learned yesterday, that a treifa cannot survive for 12 months. B'nekeva, I have a better way of figuring it out. I don't have to wait 12 months, but kol she'eni yoledes. So I don't know how long you wait in that case, but let's call it 9 months just for the sake of argument. Amar Rav Huna kol bir yeshein bo etzem einam iskayim shnei masar chodesh. So now we're talking about worms and insects, and according to Rav Huna, they can't survive for more than 12 months. Now, I don't know if this is scientifically correct according to our science. I know in the case of mosquitoes, I checked it out in AI, and mosquitoes apparently could live up to 3 months, and that's in very unusual circumstances. But anyway, we're talking about worms and insects. Amar Papa Shmami Nomer Rav Huna, Hadi Amar Shmuel Kishos. Yeah, what's Kishos? Kishos are what's that green stuff that we put into the soup? What's it called? Squash, right? Kishos is squash. Sheslia, so it's wormy. The ibeha asur. If it's attached to the ground, then we have to assume that the worms are still alive.